Unofficial bootleg games have been around pretty much as long as gaming itself has, and I don't think the practice has ever been as prevalent as it was back in the NES days, especially when looking at all the bootlegs available for Japan's version of the console, the Famicom. Bootlegs exist in all shapes and sizes, but generally, more often than not, they don't take all that much effort to make. Occasionally though, bootleg game developers will go beyond the call of duty and try to either port a newer game to older hardware it was never released for, or just try to port a game to another company's platform. Today, let's look at a bunch of bootleg ports and demakes that came out for the NES, and also one that's vice versa.
So, you're gonna find out quickly that a lot of these ports have a couple things in common, and it's something that's paradoxical in a way, as most of these ports are somehow both completely terrible and also surprisingly impressive. Super Mario World for the NES is a perfect example of this. As you can see, this is a bootleg port of Super Mario World for the NES, complete with an overworld map, all the power-ups from the original game, including Yoshi, and while it doesn't feature all the levels from Super Mario World, not even close actually, it does have a good chunk of levels and they mostly all copy the same level design from the original game. A shocking amount of work went into this one, and the attention to detail is commendable. They really tried to make an NES version of Super Mario World. Unfortunately, that's where the good ends. The game controls like absolute garbage, and momentum makes no sense at all. Holding the run button makes Mario go from 0 to 60 in a millisecond, but none of that momentum carries over into the air, so if you're trying to run and jump, the forward speed of that jump is like 1/3 of whatever speed you were just running. I can't, for the life of me, figure out the hitboxes, and the music, while tonally accurate, is god-awful. This is really bad, and no kid that got to play this got a good representation of Super Mario World. Despite the questionable execution, though, this at least proves that a competent port of the game could have definitely worked on the NES, and that includes Yoshi. I can't say that I really enjoyed myself, but I did finish it, and that's saying a lot because the last thing I expect of any bootleg is it being an actual full game that's capable of being completed. Another really impressive but janky port is Earthworm Jim 3, which is basically just a simplified port of the original Earthworm Jim game. There's 3 worlds split up into 2 levels each, with each world having a boss at the end. It's actually surprising how well they managed to make Jim's moveset sort of work on the NES. Now, you've only got 2 action buttons, so they kind of had to make do. Normally, 2 separate buttons are used to make Jim whip his head or use his gun, but since the NES only has 2 to work with, you now need to press the select button to swap between the 2. Probably this game's biggest issue is having to wrestle with the controls when enemies are attacking you. The controls aren't exactly super responsive, so sometimes an enemy just kind of has its way with you. The enemies are relentless when they attack, so if you can't get some good distance and dispatch them quickly, they deplete a ton of your health in a very short amount of time. I can tell a good amount of effort was put into this one, but it still has a lot of cheap garbage, especially when fighting Evil the Cat, so I had to utilize save states to get through this one. Still though, this is super impressive, and it's honestly better than I expected. It even looks a bit better than the official Game Boy port in my opinion, though I can't say it plays as smoothly. It's also extremely short, so if you've got some time to kill, this might be worth checking out at least once. I'd play it on mute though, because the music is pretty rough on the ears. Are you a big fan of the NES but always thought, man, you know what would make this console better? If I could run Windows 98 on this puppy. Well, then you're in luck. Now, there isn't a ton of info out there about the origins of this bootleg pseudo port, but it is known that it was made by a Chinese developer named Bei Tongfeng sometime in the early 2000s. I know this isn't technically a port, but whatever, just roll with it, okay? Now, there isn't really much you can actually do with this little piece of homebrew software, as it's pretty much 100% superficial, but there are a few things tucked away if you dig for a little bit. Loading up Internet Explorer, among other things, doesn't actually do anything, and no buttons are clickable. And there's even icons for stuff like Adobe Photoshop, which unsurprisingly doesn't actually work. Almost all of this is just little navigatable menus to create the illusion of the Windows operating system, but there are a few bitmap images that can be found and opened, like this bootleg Pikachu, for example. You also have access to stuff like the recycling bin, clock, volume slider, and a lot of things you'd find in an actual copy of Windows, but like I said, none of it actually works. You can't even move the volume slider. I have no idea what the purpose of this odd piece of homebrew's creation was, but it's super strange and at least worth messing around in for a couple minutes for the sheer novelty of it, and I think maybe that's all this thing exists for. Okay, so by now, and judging by the comments in my last video, a lot of people are aware of the infamous unofficial Felix the Cat Genesis port. We all know about the weird game over screen, and I'm sure most of you have seen the Vinesauce Joel clip, but real quick for those who haven't.
Felix het. What? What the fuck?
Now that we got that out of the way, I wanted to try this game out for myself since I really was only ever exposed to it at a convention once for a total of like 10 seconds, so I really couldn't get a feel for it. So basically, what this is a very trimmed down version of the Felix the Cat NES game ported to the Genesis. Not only were there a ton of stages omitted, but boss fights are nowhere to be found either. This is just straight up platforming from beginning to end, and unfortunately, the controls are total trash. All the level design was kept 100% the same from the NES version, but the controls you use to traverse them, well, they're, devoid of physics. I don't know how better to describe it. It's something you have to feel for yourself, but there's almost no actual weight to anything, and momentum basically isn't a thing. All the movement feels super robotic, and it's overall just unpleasant to control. Also, the music goes super hard for no reason, but I definitely recognize a couple tracks here, and I can assure you they are not from this game. It's just a bunch of songs pulled from other games, I think, played at random. And I really do mean random because the songs themselves shuffle and there's no one track for any one stage. Unlike most bootlegs, this one surprisingly was not a product of China, but Russia this time. As someone who has a ton of admiration for Felix the Cat on NES, this one is extremely painful to play. Normally I'd suggest trying stuff like this out, but in this case I'd suggest avoiding it. It's so identical visually to the source material except for the fact that they made the game bad. Don't let the name fool you. Mortal Kombat 3 is in fact not Mortal Kombat 3, but rather a port of the original Mortal Kombat game. It's got all your favorite characters, Liu Kang, Sonya Blade, Raiden, and like the original Mortal Kombat game, you fight your way to the top by taking on all the other characters, twice. And when you finally knock out the normal roster, you're faced with quite a fearsome foe, a comically small version of Goro, who apparently doesn't have any special attacks. Or maybe I just didn't see any of them because I kept stun locking him. Once you've beaten all the other fighters, it's time to take on the game's final boss, the ruthless Skang Tsung. Now apparently there's multiple Mortal Kombat bootlegs and they're all under extremely confusing names. There's one that's called Mortal Kombat 3 that's actually Mortal Kombat 3 but has the title screen of Mortal Kombat 4, one called Mortal Kombat 2 that's a port of Mortal Kombat, as well as another one called Mortal Kombat 2 Special, which is a port of Mortal Kombat 2. None of this makes any sense. Just know this is a really not good port of Mortal Kombat 1 to the NES. Not that it's really much worse than the official Game Boy port, if we're being honest here. Anyway, I can't figure out how to jump diagonally, Sub-Zero's ice attack doesn't freeze, and they straight up called this man Skang Tsung. Also, if you go through the whole game on one of the easier difficulties, it doesn't even give you a credit screen, it just says to try a different difficulty. If the game looks clunky as hell, it's because it is. I don't know if any other of the bootleg Mortal Kombat ports are any better, but this one sure is a dumpster fire. Following the theme of incorrectly numbered fighting games, here's a port of Street Fighter II called Street Fighter III, starring your two favorite characters, Ryu and Ryu with Wig. This one I have to say is a bit of a step up in terms of an attempt at a true fighting game for the NES, but it's still honestly pretty terrible. The visuals this time look kinda nice besides the character portraits, but the game is so insanely difficult that I can't even get through it on the easiest difficulty. You're able to select difficulty on a scale of 0 through 10, but even on like level 2 I couldn't even win the first match against Chun-Li. Eventually, I was able to start winning matches, but that was only after putting the game on the absolute lowest difficulty and then using Vega's ridiculously long reach to cheese enemies. And eventually, that stopped working too, at which point I switched to Dalsim and took an even cheaper route, which honestly was probably the most ideal thing to do because Dalsim's normal punch attack makes him crouch at such an angle that I think he's the only fighter that's able to successfully dodge Guile's sonic boom. As just like the Mortal Kombat port, the jumping in this game barely functions. I also couldn't figure out how to pull off even a single special attack, and no amount of quarter circle punches awarded me even a single Hadouken. I'll at least commend this bootleg for having pretty decent animations by NES standards. Tiny Toon Adventure 6, from what I can tell, is a pretty competent port of the Game Boy game Tiny Toon Adventures Bab's Big Break to the NES. I say from what I can tell because I haven't completed it, but from what I've read, it's got 4 stages and so does Bab's Big Break. I mentioned this in my Game Boy video, but Bab's Big Break was actually one of my favorite games to play when I was a kid, so it's kind of cool to see a console version of it completely in color. Now, after playing it for a while, it does feel like the controls are a bit off. I haven't played Bab's Big Break in a long time, so I can't be certain, but they definitely seem kinda wonky. Other than that, though, everything else is executed pretty well. The levels were recreated properly, the color looks really nice, bosses were implemented properly, and they even retain the same story and cutscenes as well. I have no idea what kind of work goes into something like this, but from what I can tell, it's pretty accurate to the original game. Even the swappable character mechanic was pulled off. In the original game, you can choose between Buster, Plucky, or Hampton at any point in time via the pause menu. They all control identically, except for not sharing the same ammo pool for their projectile weapons, those weapons all being thrown at different angles. This was all recreated in this port. Honestly, besides the controls feeling a little weird, I'd say this looks and feels something pretty close to official, and I honestly think this might be the better way to play this game considering it's actually in color. This one's definitely worth a try. The only real downside is that all the original music from Bab's Big Break is missing, and it's all been replaced by the NES Tiny Toon game soundtrack, which is admittedly pretty good, but I do wish the original music was present. And that's all I've got for today. I'm typically used to pretty much all bootleg games being hot garbage, but a few of these actually surprised me. There's no masterpieces here, but it's obvious that not every bootlegger churns out the most bottom-tier product possible for the fastest dollar. And I'd honestly say the Tiny Toons port might be a legitimate option for playing Bab's Big Break. There's a few more that I didn't cover that I have in mind for next time, but if you've got bootleg ports that you think are worth checking out, or very not worth checking out, ironically making them worth checking out, feel free to comment them below. Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you liked it and want to see more, there's a couple other videos right there you can check out. And if you want to see everything I upload, subscribe and tap the bell icon. And if you want to help support the channel, I have a Patreon right there too.